Hey everybody, Idre here. No face cam today, but I will be doing a 90s rock alternative tier ranking video. I didn't make this list, so there are some bands on here that I don't know much about, so they may not rank as high as others, not gonna lie. But a good amount of these, the vast majority of these, I have taken time to dig deep into their discography. So I have a pretty good opinion. We're going to be going in the order that they appear on our screen. And I know there's a lot of stuff missing here, so it's not my fault. This is just the one that I found that I thought had the best selection. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 16, like around 20 on here. So let's start with Alice in Chains. In my honest opinion, I would probably put Alice in Chains in the average tier. Now, the reason I put them down low, I guess you could say, in that average tier, isn't because I dislike their music. It just, I've always felt that their music hasn't aged the best compared to some of the other bands from this era. I think in general, I think they have, it's not like they've gotten worse, but their sound is a bit too 90s sounding to the point where unless I'm in the mood for something 90s, I can't really get into their music. But let's move on to Blur. Blur is a band that I have some mixed feelings on, and they fall pretty solidly into the good territory for me. I like their early material. I like their stuff quite a bit, although I will admit I do prefer Oasis. But for me, where they start to lose me is later on in their career, and even in the 90s. I don't find their music as appealing as some of the other bands, even in the Britpop scene. I know that I'm kind of the odd one out in this scenario, because a lot of people prefer Blur over Oasis, but in my opinion, I would argue that they're a solid band and that they land pretty solidly into the good tier. Foo Fighters. Foo Fighters, for me, is poor. I mean, Foo Fighters, to me, a big part of their fame does come from the Nirvana connection, but I don't take that away from them. You know, it's not their fault. Dave Grohl's the main dude here. But for me, where they really lose me is just the bland discography. I think that overall, even in the 90s, some of their stuff to me just feels very uninspired and not that strong, to say the least. So for me, Foo Fighters, even though I do like a few songs here and there, fall pretty solidly in that little bottom tier. Green Day, for me, they definitely, if we're talking about 90s, the phenomenal tier. They have one of the strongest discographies in the 90s than any other band. Obviously, people know that I have my critiques of their newer material, but that's not what we're really talking about here. In terms of phenomenalness, I think that they are up there, without a doubt. They have a really solid, album consistency. I love their first early Lookout record stuff. I also love their more, a bit more diverse Nimrod. It all comes together really good, and I think Green Day in the 90s was one of the best bands. Nine Inch Nails, I would say oh, shoot, what did I do? I say Nine Inch Nails is pretty solidly in that great territory. I wouldn't say that they have as big and great of a discography as even some of the ones below them, but I would argue that their industrial kind of metal sound and sometimes even a bit more darker sound, and like the Downward Spiral, influenced the whole generation of artists. And I think that Trent Reznor's intelligence musically is undeniable. But just because I don't think they have as many great albums as some of the others in the 90s, that's why they're into great, not phenomenal. Needless to say, their sound was top-notch during this time. Nirvana, I would also put Nirvana in this great territory. A lot of people would put them in the phenomenal area, and I have some mixed feelings there. I quite like Nirvana. I quite like their sound, I quite like their style, and I quite like their 3 major albums. But the thing that really gets to me, though, is just the amount of praise they get. I think that they are good. I don't think they are necessarily the best. And I think that that kind of kills it for me every now and then. I does get a little tired of. They're kind of like the Beatles of the '90s. Like they're really good, but I don't think they always deserve to be at the very top. Needless to say, I mean Kurt Cobain's the musical genius. I think that Bleach, Nevermind, and Utero all solid albums. So they fall pretty solidly into this great area. Another one in the great area, in my opinion, is Oasis. Oasis gets a lot of criticism for being very Beatlesy, very ripping off the Beatles, and I 100% get that. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't really think that their discography after their first two albums was that strong, but their first two albums, definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory, are two of the greatest Britpop albums, two of the greatest albums of the 90s. And I think it goes without saying. And in my opinion, I think they follow pretty solidly into this great area. I think they were a solid band in the mid '90s. They kind of fell off towards the end of the decade, but they still made a reputation for themselves, and I think that's undeniable. Coming next is Pantera. Personally, I don't care much for Pantera. Not gonna lie. I put them in the poor territory, not because I think that they're a horrible band, but just I don't get the appeal of this sound compared to other metal genres. I think that musically they are one of the lesser interesting metal bands and I guess heavier bands from the 90s. And I never really understood all the obsession or surrounding them. That being said, I do think that, the guitar playing is obviously really strong here. I think the musicianship is off the charts in this band. It's really not for me when we're talking about musical style, and it just doesn't come off as being too innovative as time goes on. This is just my personal opinion. I'm not judging this based off any facts. But coming in here with Pearl Jam, I would have to put them in that average territory alongside Alice in Chains for a few reasons. I think that discography-wise, they're relatively solid. I don't have too many issues to say there. My one main issue, a lot of it comes from the fact that vocally they kind of influenced a generation of post-grunge, which I am not fond of. Some of the vocal styles that are prominent in post-grunge aren't that well. They're not that good, and they're hard to listen to. And a lot of that comes from this dude. And my thing with Pearl Jam is that even though I think that they were a pretty solid band for their time, I just think they're definitely one of those bands that haven't aged nearly as well as they did back then. And I think they will continue to not age as well. And they're just going to become a product of the 90s instead of becoming an influential legendary band like Nirvana. But let's move on to Pulp. Pulp is a band that I'm not as familiar with compared to some of these other artists, but they follow pretty strongly into that average territory. I do like their music. I like their style and their sound, and they kind of are also part of that whole Britpop thing. I do think they're one of the lesser interesting of the Britpop big ones, I guess you could say. But at the end of the day, I think Pulp did have a pretty solid sound, some big songs here and there, which are undeniable. And I would say compared to the two that are at the bottom, I do think that they are one of the more innovative, one of the more interesting bands to come out of this era, for at least in Britpop. And that's really my main thing there. I don't have too much else to say. I think they're a pretty average band, take it or leave it. Radiohead. Obviously, if anybody that knows me knows Radiohead, it goes to the phenomenal tier, if not the most phenomenal band of the 90s. Well, their debut, I still think, is good. Pablo Honey, it wasn't really until The Bends that they really took it to the next level. The Bends is personally one of my favorite albums of all time, but I perfectly understand why somebody would prefer OK Computer, which came only a few years later. OK Computer and The Bends both really shaped a whole generation of music, really kind of turned Britpop upside down. And in general, I think that their sound, their style in the 90s alone helped influence a whole generation of bands, good and bad. And I think their musical genius is undeniable, and I think Radiohead deserves to be in that phenomenal tier. I believe this is Rage Against the Machine. Rage Against the Machine right here. I would Seeing as I have some mixed feelings about Rage Against the Machine, and I would probably put them down in the average tier. I don't love their music. I also don't hate their music. I honestly don't care much for their music one way or the other. I think they are quite overrated. I think that they don't deserve some of the praise that they get. And that's just my opinion. I don't have too much else to say here about them, but that's about it. I guess another average, actually, REM for me goes a little bit in that average tier. If you're talking about some of their work they put out in the 80s compared to the 90s, I know that they would rank in the good tier, not the average tier. But for me, REM does have a lot of substance to them. But if we're just talking about the 90s work here, I could take it or leave it, in my opinion. I think that they were a solid band, but, and obviously they influenced Radiohead and all them. But I think compared to some of the other artists here, they're just okay. This one's going to be a little controversial, but the Red Hot Chili Peppers I'm going to put in the poor category. Not because I dislike their music, once again. It's just because I think they're vastly overrated. I quite enjoy their music a lot. I have not much negative to say about their music. But at the same time, it's not like I'm going to go head over heels to listen to them. I think that their music has been dumbed down over the years, but I will say in the 90s they had a bit more of an edge to them. But just compared to a lot of these other bands on the list, I think that they are one of the more interesting ones on here. I think that they're more, they kind of, the charm wore off really fast for me with the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They're one of those bands I liked at first, but then the more I listened to it, I wasn't as big on. But let's move on. Smashing Pumpkins, to me, where did they go? Smashing Pumpkins, I would say, is pretty solidly in that great tier. I think Smashing Pumpkins have a really good sound to them, a really strong style that I kind of wish they had more releases in the 90s, at least. But, needless to say, between Siamese Dream and Melancholy, and even Gish, these are all great, solid albums, and I think that they were one of the... They may not be viewed as highly as they were back then, but I think the Smashing Pumpkins, one of the greatest 90s bands. They're one of the quintessential 90s bands. See, I just realized I am not too familiar with this band. Not gonna lie. I'm trying to figure it out. One second. I think that's Soundgarden, right? Well, I'm gonna say it's Soundgarden. Yes, that's Soundgarden. I couldn't tell if it's cut off. But for Soundgarden, I would put them in the good tier. Soundgarden, for me, is definitely a kind of, not overlooked. They're definitely appreciated, but I do think that they do get a little bit overlooked. I think they are one of the better 90s alternative bands, without a doubt. I think that they have some of the greatest hits of the 90s. And without a doubt, I think that they are pretty good. They follow in that good area. Stone Temple Pilots, a band that I can care less for, personally. But I'm going to have to, probably, let's see. I'll put them in the average. They're okay, but I don't have much to say. Suede goes in poor. Out of all the Britpop bands, Suede's the one that really I just can't really get into. No matter what I'm getting into, no matter what I'm listening to, Suede is hard for me to get into. I'm not sure why, but they just are. The Offspring goes phenomenal for me. I think the Offspring are vastly underrated. I think not only do they have a solid discography, I think that in general, they're between Ignition, which came out in 92, Smash in 94, which is one of the best punk albums ever, and even Ixnay and Americana. Solid discography here, without a doubt. Now, the last one on this list is Weezer. Weezer goes in that good area. And it sucks, because I absolutely love the Blue album, and I like Pinkerton. I'm not as crazy for Pinkerton, but they only have 2 albums in the 90s that are actually worth it, so I feel like that's why they landed in a good, not anything different. However, I do think their later discography did get really bad. That's not what we're talking about here. So this is my final ranking of all these 90s bands. What do you guys have to say? Do you guys agree, disagree? Comment down below. That is it for now.